Hey guys, tonight we journey into a world of candlelight, polished marble floors, and the soft rustle of silk dresses as you step into the life of a young woman named Florence, born in 1820 in the bustling city of Florence, Italy, though her family's wealth and English roots immediately set her apart. Imagine for a moment the sense of a sun-warmed villa, citrus from the garden, the tang of olive oil, and a faint hint of beeswax from the chandeliers above. You probably won't survive this without acknowledging just how different her life could have been if she had simply followed the societal script of tea parties, lavish balls, and genteel idleness. But here you are, witnessing the stirrings of something exceptional. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's fun to imagine where in the world someone is pausing their evening to meet Florence. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the corridors of her home, hearing the muted chatter of servants and the distant laughter of her siblings. Her parents, William and Frances Nightingale, wield influence and expectation in equal measure, emphasizing education and social refinement, yet also allowing the curious spark in you, Florence, to roam. You notice she devours books, from medical treatises to travelogues, absorbing ideas and questioning assumptions in a way that sets her apart. Historians still argue whether this intellectual freedom was the pivotal factor in her later daring to defy societal norms, or if it was an innate obsession with care and order that drove her forward. In these formative years, you begin to understand the duality of her world, a gilded environment that offers comfort, yet one that suffocates genuine purpose if one succumbs to convention. Quirky as it seems, Florence was said to have a curious habit of counting stairs and cataloging every detail of her environment, a foreshadowing of the meticulous organization she would later impose on hospital wards. You trudge through her teenage bedroom, noting the journals, sketches, and small botanical collections, and sense the early seeds of a mission, an impulse to observe, to measure, and eventually to heal. Every footstep in these marble hallways feels heavy with possibility. Every whispered conversation around the dinner table hints at the tension between expectation and ambition. One night, you find her lingering by the window, gazing at the Arno River flowing lazily beneath the moonlight. You might chuckle at the romanticism, but she is plotting silently. How could she harness her intellect and privilege to serve those who suffer? It's almost comical to think that a young woman, encased in finery and comfort, could one day command hospitals and influence international policy. Yet, as you observe her, the air is thick with determination. Mainstream historical accounts highlight her precocious intellect and social awareness. Fringe tidbits mention her early fascination with nursing, not as domestic charity, but as a systematic art requiring observation and discipline. It is here, in this gilded room scented with oil lamps and ink, that the foundations of Florence Nightingale's life are quietly but firmly laid. You stroll past the parlor where servants arrange floral displays, and you notice her watching them, not merely out of curiosity, but in a careful study of process, efficiency, and human behavior. It's almost humorous to imagine her silently critiquing flower arrangements while pondering patient care decades in the future. Historians still argue whether this attention to detail was innate genius or the inevitable product of a privileged upbringing that allowed intellectual curiosity to bloom unchecked. Regardless, the pattern is clear. From a young age, Florence is less captivated by high society's performative displays and more entranced by the mechanics of observation, the patterns of order, and the systems of human life and care. Even the family holidays contribute to this early molding. You trudge through gardens filled with sunlight and laughter, noting how she organizes small tasks, records minute details in notebooks, and occasionally argues with her siblings over fairness and procedure. There's a quaint anecdote that she once meticulously cataloged the family's silverware, noting tarnish patterns and cleaning schedules, which makes you grin at the foreshadowing of hospital audits. These early experiences, mundane as they seem, forge an inner discipline, blending intellect with empathy, a combination that will later define her transformative influence on healthcare. In sum, this early life in Florence is a tapestry of privilege, curiosity, and precocious attention to detail. You can feel the stirrings of the woman who will later revolutionize nursing, a person capable of seeing beyond societal expectations into systems, patterns, and processes. The path is subtle, invisible even, but unmistakably present. A young mind rich in observation, growing restless with mere comfort, itching for meaningful impact. You exit the villa's corridors, leaving behind the scent of beeswax and the echo of intellectual stirrings, and step toward a destiny that will illuminate hospitals, charts, and statistics for generations. You wake to the soft clatter of teacups and the faint aroma of baking bread drifting through the corridors of the Nightingale estate, sensing that Florence's formative years are quietly transforming into purpose-driven adolescence. Imagine her walking barefoot across cold marble floors, her journal clutched tightly as she scribbles observations on everything from the geometry of the garden to the way the morning light falls on the panes of glass. You probably won't survive this without noticing that she isn't merely being a dutiful daughter. There's a spark of defiance, an early intuition that life is about action, not idle observation. So, before you settle further into the tale, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, as always, share your location and local time so we can imagine together where you are while peeking into the 19th century. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's continue down this quiet, purposeful path. You trudge alongside her through the estate's library, lined with leather-bound volumes that smell faintly of mildew and ink, and you notice her fascination with mathematics and statistics, an unusual pursuit for a young woman of her standing. Her father, William Nightingale, encourages rigorous study, believing that intellectual training is essential for moral and social development. Historians still argue whether this exposure to numbers and systems is what later empowered her to create revolutionary hospital statistics, or if her compassion alone would have driven similar reforms. Meanwhile, quirky tidbits surface. She reportedly measured the height of every doorframe in the house, noting inconsistencies, and once tried to calculate the perfect slope of a staircase to prevent accidents. A small but telling glimpse into her obsession with precision. In these adolescent years, you sense Florence testing boundaries. You follow her as she challenges household conventions, gently correcting a servant's sweeping technique or reorganizing the linen closet to optimize efficiency. It's almost comical imagining a young lady wielding such authority. Yet this pattern reflects an early commitment to order and effectiveness, principles that will define her nursing philosophy decades later. Scholars still debate whether this meticulous nature stemmed from innate personality traits or the meticulous upbringing imposed by her parents. But the result is clear. She develops an eye for detail that will soon extend beyond domestic spaces into hospitals and wards far from her home. Lunch at the estate is a study in contrast. The family enjoys refined dishes while Florence observes patterns, how servants manage multiple tasks, how bread dough rises inconsistently, and how the social order subtly dictates who speaks and who listens. You can almost see her mental ledger balancing efficiency with empathy, observation with understanding. Fringe anecdotes suggest she once insisted on measuring the exact angle at which soup ladles should be held to avoid spills, which, while eccentric, demonstrates the precocious attention to procedure that foreshadows her later work on sanitary protocols. By evening, you follow her into the gardens again, where she pauses beneath a blooming rose bush, contemplating both beauty and utility. She sketches plants with meticulous annotations about growth patterns and water needs, combining aesthetic appreciation with methodical documentation. Historians still argue whether these botanical pursuits were mere hobbies or early training in observational rigor that later proved essential in tracking patient outcomes and mortality rates. Regardless, it's clear that Florence is cultivating a mind both disciplined and curious, laying the groundwork for the statistical analyses that would one day transform hospitals. Night falls and the house quiets. You watch Florence tracing her finger along the veins of a leaf, whispering measurements to herself, an almost meditative ritual that blends curiosity with precision. Her journals, filled with sketches, calculations, and notes, are both a refuge and a laboratory. Mainstream history emphasizes her early commitment to learning and self-improvement. Quirky accounts note her fascination with the light reflecting off glass vials, a precursor to her later obsession with clean, bright hospital wards. You trudge past the flickering candlelight, realizing that these ordinary seeming habits of her youth are the subtle scaffolding upon which extraordinary professional impact will be built. In sum, this stage of Florence's life is one of quiet preparation, a blend of intellectual curiosity, early responsibility, and disciplined observation. You feel the threads of destiny weaving around her, the fascination with measurement, her insistence on order, the gentle defiance against passive expectations. You can almost hear the whisper of future wards and patient charts in these late-night musings as the young woman begins transforming everyday spaces into laboratories for learning and improvement. And as you step away from her garden under the soft glow of twilight, it becomes increasingly clear that Florence Nightingale's life is destined to be one where meticulous observation meets profound compassion, shaping the future of nursing and healthcare itself. You wander with Florence into her late teens, and the estate seems both familiar and increasingly confining, as if the walls themselves are whispering expectations she is determined to question. Imagine her pacing the long corridors at dusk, her thoughts spinning like the hands of a meticulous clock, considering what it means to live a life of purpose beyond the gilded comforts of her privileged upbringing. You probably won't survive this without noticing her restless energy, a mix of impatience and curiosity that propels her toward decisions that shock polite society. So, before you sink further into this period, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Share your location and local time too, so we can imagine exactly where you are while stepping through 19th century England. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and settle into the rhythms of her world. You follow her into the bustling London streets as she begins sneaking excursions from her estate, observing the sick and poor with wide, empathetic eyes. The contrast between her comfortable home and the city's poverty is jarring, and you trudge beside her through narrow alleys, smelling smoke and waste, mingling with fresh bread from bakeries. Mainstream historians note that Florence's exposure to urban illness and deprivation profoundly shaped her mission to reform hospital care, but quirky accounts tell that she sometimes collected small scraps of discarded medical equipment, like tattered bandages or broken thermometers, as study curiosities. Scholars still argue whether her empathy was innate or cultivated through these immersive experiences. But you can see that both rigor and compassion are already entwined in her approach. Back at the estate, she debates her future with her family, insisting she wants to pursue nursing despite the social stigma. You can almost hear the faint gasp of propriety echoing through the drawing rooms. Her mother and sister are bewildered. Her father, cautiously supportive, emphasizes practical preparation. Fringe stories suggest she once staged a mock hospital in the estate's servants' quarters, instructing maids in careful cleaning and basic patient care, much to their confusion and occasional amusement. Historians still argue whether these early experiments were playful training or serious proto-clinical exercises, but the intent is clear. Florence is preparing both mentally and practically for the challenges ahead. You witness her traveling to informal training sites, sometimes hopping onto carriages to visit charitable hospitals, where the contrast between squalor and her expectations is stark. She notes the inefficiency, the overcrowding, and the lack of sanitation, scribbling furiously into her ever-present journals. Her observations are not just passive. She begins proposing small improvements, like better bed spacing and improved ventilation, which sparks minor outrage among staff who are resistant to change. Quirky anecdotes report that she even used a pocket compass to measure distances between beds, insisting on accuracy, a tiny precursor to her later statistical charts. Scholars still debate whether these early interventions were naive or visionary, but they undeniably reveal a mind already aligned with systemic reform. Evening brings introspection. You trudge alongside her through candlelit streets back to her estate, noticing how the distant tolling of church bells seems to punctuate her contemplations. She writes letters to mentors and acquaintances, outlining her vision of healthcare reform with both passion and precision. Mainstream accounts highlight these letters as evidence of her determination. Fringe stories recall that she sometimes hid notes in flowers for her sisters to find, blending secrecy with creative expression. Historians still argue whether this blend of formal and whimsical communication helped her connect with allies or simply reflects her complex personality. By nightfall, Florence reviews her journals in her private study, the quiet punctuated by the occasional rustle of paper and her soft, deliberate breathing. You observe how meticulously she organizes her observations. Notes on hygiene, ventilation, patient nutrition, and care routines coalesce into proto-guidelines for effective nursing. These routines are extraordinary for a woman of her social station, and the tension between societal expectation and personal calling is palpable. Scholars still debate whether her intense focus on structure overshadowed the human element, or whether the two were always inseparable in her methodology. Either way, her late-night labor of love cements the foundations for the innovations that will define her legacy. In sum, these adolescent and early adult experiences are transformative. You sense Florence moving from observation to intention, from curiosity to strategic planning, and from empathy to actionable vision. Every step she takes through the streets, every note jotted in her journals, and every whispered plan in the candlelight gardens of her family home nudges her closer to a life where meticulous attention, bold courage, and moral clarity converge. And as you follow her to the threshold of adult life, it's impossible not to feel the quiet electricity of destiny shaping a future reformer, statistician, and tireless advocate for humane, effective healthcare. You trudge with Florence into the first formal stages of her nursing education, a world that is still largely male-dominated and skeptical of women daring to claim professional authority. Imagine her stepping into austere lecture halls, the scent of chalk dust mingling with the faint tang of antiseptic, or what passed for it at the time, and the murmur of students and instructors discussing anatomy, wound care, and disease management. You probably won't survive this without noticing her determination to absorb every detail, jotting notes in her tiny, precise handwriting while silently judging sloppy procedures. So, before you get fully immersed, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time so we can imagine exactly where you are while following her meticulous journey. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's continue down these crowded corridors of learning. You see her observing the wards with wide, analytical eyes, mentally cataloging everything: the arrangement of beds, the cleanliness of floors, the speed and efficiency of nurses moving between patients. Mainstream historians note that these observations were crucial in forming her revolutionary ideas about sanitation and hospital design. But quirky details persist that she sometimes measured water temperature with rudimentary thermometers she scavenged herself, insisting on exactitude. Scholars still argue whether these obsessive practices were unusual for her time or simply an expression of the meticulous habits she had honed since childhood. But they undeniably set the stage for her later innovations. Between lectures and ward visits, she engages with patients, listening to their complaints and noting their needs. You trudge beside her as she jots down dietary suggestions, alternative bedding arrangements, and the small comforts that modern readers might take for granted. A clean sheet, a properly heated room, or a quiet corner to recover. Fringe stories claim she sometimes talked to patients about poetry or literature to lift spirits, blending scientific rigor with emotional intelligence. Historians still debate whether these interactions were typical nursing practice or uniquely Nightingale, but the integration of empathy with procedural precision becomes increasingly evident. Florence also navigates societal expectations. Her presence in the hospitals challenges the assumptions of both male supervisors and her peers. You notice the sideways glances, the whispered critiques, and the occasional outright skepticism she meets, yet her confidence never wavers. Quirky anecdotes tell of her correcting male doctors mid-procedure with polite but firm insistence, a move that scandalized some and inspired others. Scholars still argue whether these confrontations were strategic or simply expressions of natural authority, but the effect is the same. She earns respect through competence and unwavering moral clarity. At night, you follow her back to her lodgings, walking through dimly lit streets and quiet alleys, the distant echoes of carriage wheels and street vendors punctuating the soft hum of city life. She reviews her notes by candlelight, translating observations into actionable strategies. Mainstream accounts highlight these nightly reflections as the crucible in which her data-driven approach to nursing emerged. But fringe tales claim she sometimes scribbled diagrams on scraps of parchment and hid them under floorboards, as if the walls themselves were confiding in her. Historians still argue whether this secrecy was playful or practical, but it reinforces the idea that Florence's mind is constantly in motion, synthesizing experience into reform. Her focus extends to hygiene and sanitation, areas largely neglected in most institutions of the day. You watch her measuring bed spacing, observing hand-washing practices, or the lack thereof, and noting the flow of air through poorly ventilated wards. She experiments, suggesting minor adjustments that seem radical to those around her. Windows propped open, linens washed more frequently, and rudimentary charts to track patient recovery. Quirky accounts insist she even carried small vials of alcohol to disinfect tools, a practice that seems instinctual rather than learned. Scholars still debate whether these measures were exceptional for the period or part of broader, underappreciated movements toward cleanliness, but Florence's vision for systematic reform is clearly germinating. Finally, you accompany her as she begins to map out the logistical complexities of hospital care. Supply chains, staffing rotations, and patient flow. Mainstream historians credit these early organizational skills as foundational to her later work in the Crimean War hospitals. Yet fringe observations suggest she sometimes drew these diagrams in the margins of personal letters, blending private reflection with professional foresight. Scholars still argue whether this was a sign of obsessive perfectionism or innovative genius, but you can feel the beginnings of a methodology that will transform healthcare. In sum, this period of formal nursing education and early practical experience shows Florence moving from theory to applied observation, blending rigorous analysis with compassionate practice. You sense her stepping into a world of challenge and resistance. Yet each careful step, each note, and each small experiment prepares her for the monumental work that lies ahead, bridging the gap between inherited privilege and professional authority in a way few women of her era could imagine. You trudge alongside Florence as she takes her first major steps into hands-on nursing, entering wards where the smell of unwashed bodies, spilled broth, and faintly metallic blood hangs thick in the air. It's one of those moments where your senses revolt slightly, and you probably won't survive this without flinching at least once. But she doesn't. Instead, Florence moves with a quiet precision, noting each patient's condition, the layout of their beds, and the habits of the staff around her. So, before you get fully comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time so we can imagine exactly where you are while navigating these crowded, echoing corridors with her. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's walk deeper into her immersive world of patient care. The mainstream historical fact you notice first is that she starts meticulously recording mortality rates and causes of death in her wards. This was not common practice for the time. Hospitals were largely reactive, treating symptoms without systematic tracking. Quirky stories suggest she sometimes used color-coded charts, where different shades represented different illnesses or outcomes, creating a visual language of suffering and recovery that fascinated visitors and scandalized traditionalists. Historians still argue whether her obsession with numerical data was inspired by purely empirical science or an almost obsessive desire to control the chaos around her. But it undeniably forms the backbone of her later innovations. As you follow her, you see Florence correcting improper procedures gently but firmly. She instructs one nurse on how to bandage wounds to prevent infection, adjusting fingers and wrapping technique with a quiet authority that commands attention without hostility. Fringe tales claim she once refused to allow a senior doctor to apply leeches in a ward she supervised because she felt it risked patient survival, creating a minor scandal that would ripple through hospital gossip for weeks. Scholars still debate whether these confrontations were signs of arrogance or early leadership acumen, but you can feel the unmistakable power of competence combined with empathy. During her rounds, she also begins to influence the atmosphere in the wards. You trudge beside her, noting how she arranges patients so that light falls evenly on their faces, windows open to provide fresh air, and small personal touches, like a clean pillow or a simple piece of cloth, soften the institutional harshness. Quirky anecdotes suggest she occasionally encouraged patients to write or draw as a form of distraction, an almost experimental approach to mental well-being that predated modern occupational therapy. Historians still argue whether such interventions had measurable clinical impact or were more psychological morale boosters, but you witness the integration of care for body and mind. Florence also tackles logistical chaos. You follow her as she organizes linen storage, rationed food supplies, and instrument cleaning routines, making mental notes on inefficiencies and devising solutions. Mainstream accounts confirm that these early organizational steps were revolutionary, as hospitals previously operated without standard systems. Fringe details tell of her measuring linen quantities against patient numbers, making tiny charts that would later influence large-scale reforms, almost as if she were sketching blueprints for hospital management before she even left her small training wards. Scholars still debate whether these habits were born of necessity, innate genius, or obsessive orderliness, but the effect is clear. Florence's methodical approach transforms her environment, patient by patient. Then there's the human side, the quirky yet deeply revealing interactions with patients. You trudge alongside her as she listens to complaints, sometimes whispers, sometimes cries, noting everything down in a tiny notebook. Fringe stories claim she could calm patients merely by adjusting their bedding or offering a warm drink, almost a kind of subtle, intuitive alchemy. Historians still argue whether these interventions were scientifically grounded or instinctive, but they illustrate her holistic approach, blending observation, empathy, and practical care in a way that challenges the era's norms. As night falls, you walk back with her to her quarters, the city quiet except for distant carriage wheels and the occasional shout from a late-night street vendor. She reviews her notes by candlelight, cataloging observations and drafting minor procedural reforms, already anticipating the scale of work she might implement on a larger stage. Mainstream sources note that this kind of reflective practice was unusual for nurses at the time, yet fringe accounts hint she sometimes inscribed secret diagrams and patient case sketches into the margins of her letters, almost as if her mind refused to rest, continuously structuring the chaos she encountered. Scholars still debate whether these habits reflect obsessive tendencies or pioneering foresight, but you feel the formation of a mind that will transform healthcare. By the end of this period, you can sense Florence solidifying her philosophy. Rigorous observation, meticulous record-keeping, practical reforms, and a humane touch all blended into one comprehensive approach. You trudge beside her in the corridors of memory and history, seeing the nascent structures of what will later become modern nursing practices. She is no longer merely a student or observer. She is quietly commanding change, one small, carefully measured step at a time. You follow Florence into the wider world beyond her initial wards, trudge along cobblestone streets lined with the smells of roasting meat, horse manure, and the occasional waft of lavender from a vendor's basket. You probably won't survive this without grimacing at least once at the melange of odors, but she moves with purpose, her mind on the hospitals she's left behind and the new challenges ahead. So, before you get fully comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Don't forget to post your location and local time so we can imagine the world she navigates from wherever you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's continue walking in her shoes. Historically, Florence now begins engaging directly with military hospitals, notably those serving soldiers in the Crimean War, where unsanitary conditions are rampant. Mainstream accounts confirm that death rates in these hospitals can reach as high as 42%, primarily from preventable diseases like typhus and cholera, rather than battle wounds. Fringe tidbits describe her carrying a small personal lamp during inspections, moving quietly through night corridors, checking the alignment of cots, and ensuring every corner is ventilated. Some even say she spoke to rats in a hissing whisper to calm them, though that may be exaggeration. Scholars still argue whether her attention to detail was pragmatic, instinctual, or a mixture of both, but the effect is undeniable. As you trudge beside her through the wards, you notice Florence's insistence on hygiene. Linen is boiled, bandages washed meticulously, floors scrubbed, and water systems tested wherever possible. Quirky stories tell of her creating improvised hand-washing stations with pitchers of water and soap, a revolutionary step when nurses elsewhere simply wiped hands on cloths or ignored cleanliness entirely. Historians still argue whether this practice alone significantly reduced infection, or if it was her combination of observation, isolation of sick patients, and better nutrition that drove mortality rates down. But you can see the dramatic difference it makes as soldiers recover more quickly. She also confronts bureaucracy with quiet ferocity. You trudge through meetings with skeptical army officials, her voice calm but firm, presenting charts and mortality tables with patient-by-patient breakdowns. Fringe tales claim she once intentionally left blank spaces in her logs to prod officials into asking questions, a subtle form of manipulation to ensure engagement. Scholars still debate whether these tactics were politically clever or slightly manipulative, but the outcome is the same. Florence begins bending the hospital system to accommodate humane practices. Even as she manages logistics, Florence never neglects the human element. You walk beside her as she speaks with wounded soldiers, learning their fears, reassuring them, and occasionally reading aloud from letters she has carried from home. Quirky anecdotes suggest she sometimes knitted small personal items for soldiers or arranged flowers in common areas to lift morale, gestures that seem almost whimsical but are psychologically potent. Historians still argue whether these interventions materially affected recovery or served mainly to build morale, but the impact on her reputation and patient trust is clear. You notice that Florence keeps exhaustive records during these tours: charts, tables, sketches of ward layouts, and notes on procedural inefficiencies. Mainstream sources note that she collates these into documents that will later influence British military policy and hospital design worldwide. Fringe stories claim she sometimes coded her notes to prevent prying eyes from bureaucrats who resisted reform, a secretive habit that hints at both cleverness and obsession. Scholars still debate the ethicality of such secrecy, but you witness the emergence of someone dedicated to change above all else. By the end of these early inspections, Florence's presence in the hospitals has become transformative. Soldiers are cleaner, cots are better spaced, medical staff are more attentive, and infection rates begin to drop. You trudge beside her, feeling the energy she pours into each act of care, witnessing the slow but relentless march toward modern nursing principles. Her methods, though unorthodox at times, lay a foundation that will reverberate far beyond the wards she touches directly. You follow Florence as the winter chill seeps into the hospital corridors, your breath fogging in the dim candlelight while she moves with a lantern in one hand and a notebook in the other. You probably won't survive this without imagining the icy draft cutting through every poorly insulated stone wall, the moan of injured soldiers, and the damp smell of linen and disinfectants mixing with smoke from stoves barely keeping the wards warm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Share your location and local time in the comments so we can all feel simultaneously frozen and inspired. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's continue tracing her footsteps. At this stage, Florence begins systematically restructuring the hospital routines. Mainstream accounts highlight that she implements strict schedules for feeding, washing, and medical rounds, radically reducing chaos. Quirky tidbits note that she sometimes instructed nurses to sing during mealtimes to boost morale, turning routine into ritual. Historians still argue whether such psychological interventions directly influenced recovery rates, but they undeniably shaped a sense of order and calm in an otherwise chaotic environment. You trudge beside her as she navigates the endless bureaucracy of the military administration, carrying reports and mortality statistics to the War Office in London. Fringe accounts claim she hand-delivered messages in secret envelopes to avoid obstruction by resistant officials, a dramatic move that might border on espionage. Scholars still debate whether this was a necessary subversion of red tape or an overreach of authority, but it demonstrates her commitment to effective care over protocol. Florence also pioneers hygiene education among the nurses and aides, demonstrating proper hand washing and methods for cleaning wounds. Mainstream sources indicate that she uses a form of early germ theory, recognizing the link between filth and disease before the wider medical community accepts it. A quirky story tells of her challenging a particularly skeptical surgeon to scrub up before each procedure, reportedly saying, "Even the germs have rights." A humorous, if likely embellished, anecdote. Historians still argue whether her insistence on cleanliness was based more on observation or a proto-scientific understanding. Yet it undeniably transforms practices. You trudge with her as she personally supervises the layout of wards. Beds are spaced to allow airflow, windows opened when possible, and water containers strategically placed to minimize contamination. Fringe tales suggest she sometimes marked floor patterns with chalk to enforce spacing, a simple act with remarkable consequences. Scholars debate whether such minor interventions were key to reducing infection rates, but the resulting drop in mortality is impossible to ignore. Throughout these tours, Florence documents every detail meticulously, You watch as she jots down patient numbers, symptoms, and outcomes, creating what many consider the first modern statistical health reports. Mainstream historians praise her methodical approach, noting that these reports later influenced global hospital administration. Quirky accounts claim she even colored code data with inks she invented herself, a personal flair that adds both clarity and artistry. Scholars still argue whether her statistical methods were revolutionary in concept or merely innovative in execution. But her meticulous record-keeping sets a standard for modern epidemiology. By the end of these winter inspections, Florence has cemented her role not just as a caretaker, but as an architect of hospital reform. You trudge beside her, seeing the change in real time. Soldiers are healthier, the staff is more disciplined, and the wards are almost unrecognizably orderly compared to your first steps in the chaotic environment. Her insistence on hygiene, morale, and structured care begins to ripple outward, setting the stage for lasting change. Her energy is relentless, and you can't help but feel that the lantern she carries illuminates far more than the darkened halls. It lights the path toward modern nursing itself. You trudge behind Florence as spring begins to thaw the frost that has lingered in the hospital courtyards. The sun slanting through high windows and catching dust motes like tiny constellations. You probably won't survive this without imagining the sharp contrast between the sterile order she enforces and the wild, unpredictable chaos of life outside the wards. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Don't forget to post your location and local time. Let's see who's awake with us under their own version of the night sky. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's continue down Florence's meticulous path. As the hospital shifts from the harsh winter to milder months, Florence refines her innovations. Mainstream historical records highlight her establishment of laundry protocols that prevent the spread of lice and other infections. Fringe accounts suggest she would personally inspect sheets and bandages, sometimes sniff testing for dampness or mold, a slightly eccentric but effective practice. Historians still argue whether such hands-on inspection was necessary or symbolic, but it undeniably emphasized cleanliness and vigilance. You trudge with her through the corridors, observing the nurses as they follow her increasingly complex schedules. Mainstream sources note that she institutes time-structured feeding and medicine rounds, dramatically cutting down on missed doses. A quirky detail mentions that she used small bells to signal specific tasks, creating a subtle auditory rhythm that brought an almost musical order to the wards. Scholars debate whether these minor auditory cues had measurable effects on recovery, yet they certainly enforced discipline. Florence also pioneers early patient comfort initiatives. You notice her supervising the adjustment of bedding, ensuring injured soldiers sit upright for digestion, and that ventilation is optimal to reduce damp odors. Some fringe tales say she would place small personal items like combs or coins at bedside for morale, an almost whimsical touch that humanizes the regimented environment. Historians still argue whether these gestures were widespread or occasional, but they point to her holistic approach to care. While you follow, Florence introduces basic health education to the soldiers themselves, demonstrating how to keep their bandages clean and wounds dry. Mainstream historians credit her with reducing secondary infections significantly, linking it to her insistence on simple, observable hygiene practices. A quirky aside suggests she sometimes taught using playful analogies, comparing germs to mischievous sprites hiding in corners. Scholars still argue whether the metaphors were pedagogical genius or just charming eccentricity, yet the effectiveness of her communication is clear. The nurses, inspired by Florence's energy and discipline, begin to take more initiative. You watch as they organize supply storage, inventory medication, and even rotate responsibilities to prevent fatigue. Mainstream sources praise this empowerment as an early example of structured nursing leadership. Fringe records suggest that Florence held impromptu strategy meetings in hallways, pacing like a general planning campaigns rather than a hospital administrator. Historians still debate whether these sessions were formally organized or spontaneous bursts of oversight, but they undeniably strengthened operational efficiency. By now, the wards hum with a quiet, purposeful energy. You trudge alongside Florence, noticing how her presence alone sets the tone, a balance of strict discipline and subtle empathy. Soldiers are calmer, infections are declining, and morale seems buoyed by her relentless attention to detail. She documents every outcome with precision, noting the slight improvements in recovery times and hospital atmosphere. Fringe accounts suggest she sometimes annotated her reports with doodles of angels and little sketches of the wards, a human touch in the cold statistics. Historians still argue whether these personal touches influenced her report's reception or were purely expressive, but they make the data uniquely memorable. The days stretch, blending spring sunlight with candlelight during evening rounds, and you trudge behind her, realizing that Florence has transformed not just the hospital's procedures, but its culture. She insists on communication, accountability, and a personal investment in each patient's recovery. You see the ripple effect. The nurses' confidence grows, soldiers respond with steadier compliance, and even the most skeptical surgeons begin to respect her judgment. Her innovations, though small in isolation, bells, tidbits of comfort, cleanliness, compound into systemic reform. You can almost feel the invisible threads of Florence's influence weaving through every corner of the hospital, setting a precedent for modern nursing practices that would echo long after she leaves these halls. You trudge through the wards as the summer sun begins to blaze, turning the stone corridors into warm, dry channels of light. And you probably won't survive this without imagining the heat pressing down on the patients and staff alike. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Don't forget to post your location and local time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's continue walking with Florence. As summer sets in, Florence's relentless attention to sanitation becomes even more critical. Mainstream accounts highlight her use of improved ventilation and open windows to prevent the stench of stagnant air from worsening already fragile conditions. A quirky tidbit. Some nurses recall Florence scattering herbs like rosemary and lavender through the halls, a fragrant if unconventional attempt at ward aromatherapy. Historians still argue whether these smells actually deterred disease or simply lifted morale, but they illustrate her creative problem-solving. You follow Florence as she inspects the water supply, ensuring that drinking water is filtered and fresh, an innovation that significantly reduces dysentery outbreaks. Fringe anecdotes tell of her personally testing the water with small insects, noting their reactions, a practice that might strike modern sensibilities as both clever and bizarre. Scholars debate whether these tests had any empirical value, yet they underscore her commitment to empirical observation in a time when superstition often dictated medical practice. On the patient wards, Florence emphasizes nutrition. You watch her reorganize meals, ensuring they are balanced, regular, and easy to digest, often surprising soldiers with small additions like fruit or lightly cooked vegetables, a luxury in wartime hospitals. Some fringe sources claim she experimented with what she called digestive-friendly arrangements, stacking meals by texture and temperature. Historians still argue whether these adjustments materially improved recovery or served primarily to boost spirits, but the attention to diet shows her holistic approach. You trudge behind her as she coordinates nursing rotations to prevent exhaustion. Mainstream records note her insistence on shifts, ensuring nurses remained alert and attentive. A quirky note: she kept personal journals recording minor personal victories, like how many bandages each nurse prepared or how many beds were turned daily. Scholars still argue whether these notes were practical tools or obsessive documentation, but they reflect her meticulous personality. During afternoon rounds, Florence engages with the patients personally, listening to complaints and offering reassurance. Mainstream historians praise her bedside manner as revolutionary, shifting focus from purely procedural care to emotional support. Fringe accounts suggest she sometimes brought small tokens or handmade notes to patients, tiny gestures that humanized the otherwise regimented hospital environment. Historians still debate whether these acts had measurable effects on recovery or were largely symbolic, but they certainly improved morale. By evening, you notice Florence conducting administrative work, tallying supplies, writing letters to supporters, and planning future reforms. Her attention to detail creates a seamless system connecting logistics with patient care. Fringe stories suggest she occasionally slept in the hospital itself, leaning against a desk amid candlelight and scattered papers, further emphasizing her dedication. Scholars debate the practical necessity of such all-night vigils, but it cements the narrative of her personal commitment to nursing innovation. As the day winds down, Florence reflects on the improvements she has implemented: clean air, purified water, better nutrition, structured shifts, and personal care. You trudge beside her, absorbing the sense that every small intervention, every slight adjustment, compounds into transformative results. Historians still argue whether Florence's success was purely her own or the culmination of collaborative effort, Yet the records and anecdotes paint a clear picture of her as the central force driving change. You trudge into the hospital at dawn again, the corridors still cool with the morning mist, and you probably won't survive this without feeling the weight of expectation pressing down on you like a thick woolen blanket. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into another day with Florence. Today, Florence is consumed with the discipline of record keeping. Mainstream accounts emphasize that she meticulously logs patient numbers, types of illness, and mortality rates, pioneering what we now recognize as modern hospital statistics. A quirky tidbit: some nurses recall Florence marking tiny sketches of soldiers' wounds in her notebooks, adding doodles that resembled little stick soldiers, almost like a secret code only she understood. Historians still argue whether these sketches were practical notes or merely a way to keep her mind engaged during long hours, but they illuminate her intense focus on details. You follow her as she inspects sanitation measures, noting the precise placement of chamber pots and ensuring that linen changes are timely and systematic. Fringe accounts mention that she experimented with different cleaning solutions, including vinegar and even a weak solution of carbolic acid, long before its antiseptic potential was widely acknowledged. Scholars debate the effectiveness of these early experiments, but they reveal her intuitive understanding of hygiene's importance. By mid-morning, Florence shifts her attention to patient comfort. You watch her instruct nurses to position beds near windows for sunlight and warmth, a basic yet transformative intervention. Quirky reports suggest she sometimes brought small pets, like canaries or tame rabbits, to wardrooms to lift spirits, a practice bordering on eccentric but undeniably heartening. Historians still argue whether these touches significantly impacted recovery rates, but morale undeniably improved. You trudge beside Florence as she oversees the preparation of meals, double-checking nutritional content and portion sizes. Mainstream sources emphasize her insistence on fresh vegetables and soups, a stark contrast to the standard fare of salted meat and hard biscuits. Fringe tales suggest she sometimes flavored broth with aromatic herbs, experimenting with taste as a subtle form of therapy. Scholars debate whether taste alone influenced convalescence, yet the attention to nutrition was undeniably revolutionary. Afternoon brings a parade of visitors, donors, officials, and curious observers. You notice Florence's calm control of these interruptions, welcoming inquiries while maintaining hospital order. A quirky note: she sometimes staged mock inspections, using dolls to demonstrate proper care techniques to new nurses, blending pedagogy with subtle humor. Historians still argue whether these demonstrations were purely practical or served as morale exercises, but they underline her creative approach to leadership. As evening falls, Florence reviews the day's data, comparing it to previous days. You trudge behind her, noticing her quiet satisfaction at small improvements. Fewer deaths, more attentive nurses, cleaner wards. Fringe records hint she occasionally muttered reminders aloud, like a private mantra, ensuring her mind never relaxed fully. Scholars debate the psychological impact of these rituals, but they underscore her relentless commitment to patient care and systemic efficiency. By nightfall, Florence makes her rounds one last time, touching a hand here, offering a word there, ensuring that no detail is overlooked. Mainstream historians laud these final inspections as the embodiment of her pioneering methodology. Quirky anecdotes describe her whispering encouragements that sounded more like bedtime stories to soldiers, merging care with human warmth. Historians still argue whether such personal interventions materially influenced recovery, but the symbolism of compassion became inseparable from her legacy. You trudge back through the chilly corridors, lantern in hand, the clatter of distant footsteps echoing softly, and you probably won't survive this without sensing the invisible scaffolding of Florence's discipline holding everything together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Share your location and local time, and let the gentle hum of the night accompany us as we follow Florence into her relentless work. Tonight, her focus turns to supply management, a task as mundane as it is vital. Mainstream sources emphasize that she revolutionized hospital logistics, ensuring medicines, bandages, and linens were stocked systematically. You watch her walk down storerooms, inspecting carefully labeled jars of tinctures and neatly folded cloths, almost as if she's choreographing a ballet of efficiency. A quirky tidbit: some accounts mention her labeling jars with playful nicknames like Doctor's Delight for a common remedy, adding a touch of levity in an otherwise grim environment. Historians still argue whether such whimsical labeling had practical benefits, but it certainly humanized the space. You follow her as she examines the records of previous weeks, comparing illnesses, recovery rates, and mortality figures with almost mathematical precision. Fringe anecdotes suggest she once used tiny pebbles on a board to track trends visually, a tactile precursor to modern data visualization. Scholars debate how much this method influenced her policy changes, but it demonstrates her unyielding drive to turn numbers into actionable care. By late evening, Florence moves to staff evaluation, quietly observing the nurses' interactions and noting performance. Mainstream records show she emphasized discipline, empathy, and attention to detail, blending authority with mentorship. Quirky tales tell of her secretly testing new recruits with unusual tasks, like folding bandages in a particular sequence or silently cleaning an area before she returned to inspect, almost like playful initiation rites. Historians still argue whether these exercises were strictly practical or partly psychological, shaping confidence and adaptability. You trudge behind her as she checks the cleanliness of surgical instruments, sometimes humming softly to keep her spirits steady. Fringe notes describe her experimenting with homemade antiseptics long before germ theory became mainstream, mixing herbs and chemicals in small vials. Scholars debate the exact efficacy of these concoctions, but they underscore her relentless curiosity and proactive approach to patient safety. As midnight nears, Florence makes her rounds to every ward. You notice her whispering encouragement to soldiers who struggle to sleep, sometimes reading a few lines of poetry or sharing gentle jokes. softening the harsh reality of military convalescence. Mainstream historians highlight this as a profound example of her holistic approach, balancing science with human care. Quirky legends suggest she occasionally drew tiny sketches on slates for bedridden patients, creating a private art gallery of hope. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of these small gestures, but they undeniably contribute to her enduring legend. Finally, you trudge with her to the administrative office, where she pens letters to officials and donors, advocating for systemic reforms in military hospitals. Mainstream sources underline that these letters shaped policy changes far beyond the immediate environment of Scutari. Fringe anecdotes mention her slipping in gentle humor, a sardonic remark about paperwork that probably made her secretary snort awake. Scholars debate how much humor influenced the reception of these letters, but they add a humanizing layer to Florence's formidable intellect. You trudge once more through the lantern-lit corridors, the faint scent of antiseptic mingling with the iron tang of the hospital, and you probably won't survive this night without sensing Florence's relentless energy pressing down on every corner of Scutari. The echoes of footsteps, the murmurs of the sick, and the occasional cough form a rhythm that she moves with effortlessly, like a conductor guiding an orchestra of healing. So, before you settle further into the story, remember to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and maybe note your location and local time as the hum of the night envelops you. Tonight, Florence focuses on the hygiene reforms that would later cement her fame. Mainstream historians agree that she dramatically reduced mortality rates by emphasizing cleanliness, ventilation, and the isolation of infectious patients. You see her scrubbing surfaces, checking bedding, and instructing nurses on meticulous hand washing, an almost meditative ritual that borders on obsession. A quirky detail, some accounts claim she would occasionally measure the air quality with rudimentary smoke tests, lighting small candles to see how the smoke moved, a primitive, almost whimsical approach to ventilation. Scholars still argue whether these early experiments significantly affected outcomes, or if the psychological impact on staff was more crucial. You follow her as she visits the laundry area, overseeing the washing of sheets and bandages. Fringe tales suggest that she personally tested the water temperature with her hands, grimacing at every inconsistency, and even concocted herbal rinses meant to disinfect while leaving a faintly soothing scent. Historians still debate how much of her herbal experimentation truly reduced infection, but it highlights her hands-on, obsessive dedication. As you trudge alongside her, Florence inspects the nutrition of the patients. Mainstream sources highlight her insistence on providing balanced meals, integrating broth, vegetables, and sometimes citrus to prevent scurvy, a forward-thinking approach for her era. Quirky anecdotes mention her occasionally sneaking small treats to boost morale, like a piece of chocolate or a berry for a recovering soldier, despite ration restrictions. Scholars still argue whether these small indulgences had measurable health benefits or were purely psychological, yet the impact on morale was unmistakable. Later, she moves to staff training, quietly observing interactions, correcting mistakes with gentle firmness, and sharing little-known facts facts about anatomy and hygiene. Fringe stories recount her using colored ribbons to indicate different levels of proficiency among nurses, a playful, almost gamified system. Historians still debate the exact structure and efficacy of these methods, but the commitment to education is clear. Her presence blends authority with warmth, a paradoxical force that inspires compliance and care simultaneously. By the witching hour, Florence is already planning for the next day, her mind shifting between logistics, patient care, and advocacy. Mainstream accounts note her habit of drafting reports late at night, detailing everything from mortality statistics to staffing concerns. A quirky note, she often doodled tiny sketches of patients' progress or humorous notes in margins, a private habit to lighten the relentless monotony. Scholars debate how much these personal touches influenced her professional effectiveness, but they reveal the human behind the legend. Finally, you trudge with her one last time to the wards, checking on the sleeping patients. She whispers soft reassurances, adjusts pillows, and quietly observes breathing patterns, making minute notes in her mind. Mainstream historians affirm that these nightly routines, though exhausting, contributed to measurable reductions in disease and death. Fringe stories claim she occasionally hummed a lullaby she'd improvised, a soft, melodic echo that reassured the fearful. Historians still argue whether this human touch impacted outcomes statistically, yet its emotional resonance is undeniable. You trudge along the cold stone corridors again, the moonlight spilling through narrow windows and casting long silver shadows that dance like ghosts on the walls. And you probably won't survive this journey through Florence's tireless nights without feeling the weight of her devotion pressing on you. So, before you nestle deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and maybe drop your location and local time, because the hum of history waits for no one. Tonight, Florence turns her attention to statistical record-keeping, an unusual obsession for a nurse in the mid-19th century. Mainstream historians credit her with pioneering modern hospital statistics, meticulously charting mortality rates, causes of death, and improvements following her sanitation reforms. You watch her with her tiny brushes of ink, her keen eyes scanning columns, occasionally leaning over the shoulder of an assistant to adjust a misaligned figure. A quirky tidbit, she reportedly color-coded dots on the mortality charts, red for deaths, black for recoveries, creating visual patterns she could interpret at a glance. Scholars still argue whether her statistical methods were scientifically rigorous by today's standards, but their innovative clarity undeniably changed hospital management forever. As you trudge past the nurses' quarters, she pauses to train staff on patient observation. Mainstream sources highlight her insistence that nurses note subtle changes in pulse, breathing, and temperature, treating the human body like a delicate, complex instrument. Fringe stories suggest she once used small, hand-carved wooden dolls to demonstrate internal organ functions to younger trainees, a playful visual aid in a time before widespread anatomical diagrams. Historians still debate how widely these inventive teaching methods spread outside Scutari, but their ingenuity is unquestionable. Later, Florence inspects the supply chain, wandering into storerooms piled high with bandages, oils, and linen. Mainstream accounts describe her scrupulous attention to inventory, ensuring nothing went to waste. A quirky detail, she sometimes used scraps of old bandages to fashion tiny cleaning rags, turning necessity into improvisational craft. Scholars still argue whether this frugality significantly impacted patient care outcomes, yet the ethos of meticulous resource management shaped her legacy. By the late hours, she walks the wards again, whispering reassurances to patients who stir in fevered sleep. Mainstream historians note her revolutionary attention to mental as well as physical health, insisting on kindness, calm, and routine. Fringe accounts suggest she occasionally read aloud excerpts of poetry to lift spirits, a gentle defiance of the grim military hospital setting. Scholars still debate the measurable effects of these psychological interventions, but the narrative of hope they conveyed is powerful. Finally, you follow her to the central planning table, where she sketches improvements for ward layouts, noting airflow, light, and access routes. Mainstream accounts confirm that her architectural suggestions minimized infection, while quirky tales claim she once drew a miniature labyrinth in the corner of a blueprint just for amusement. Historians still argue whether these minor whims had any practical impact, but the blend of logic and creativity is characteristic of Florence's approach. You trudge through the chilly hospital courtyard as dawn threatens the horizon, the chill clinging to your coat as if the night itself wants to hold you back. And you probably won't survive this tale of dedication without sensing the unyielding energy Florence pours into each waking hour. So, before you get cozy under your blanket, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and maybe tell me your local time, because even in different centuries, timing matters. Florence now focuses on reforming hygiene beyond Scutari, venturing into bureaucratic corridors of power. Mainstream historians celebrate her relentless lobbying of the British government to implement sanitary reforms across military hospitals. You can almost see her, papers in hand, pacing the marbled halls of Westminster, her signature lamp tucked under her arm like a beacon. A quirky tidbit: she reportedly carried a tiny silver thimble of her favorite scented oil to calm herself amid the formalities, a small personal ritual amidst political storms. Scholars still argue whether her presence or her statistical arguments swayed policymakers more, but both undeniably contributed to tangible change. She trains inspectors who travel to remote hospitals, teaching them to replicate the sanitation standards she established at Scutari. Mainstream accounts describe her insistence that every ward maintain consistent cleanliness, ventilation, and organization, while fringe sources note she once instructed an inspector to balance his reports on the heads of live geese as a humorous demonstration of attention to detail. Historians still debate the authenticity of this story, yet it paints a vivid picture of her inventive teaching style. Meanwhile, Florence writes correspondence that will later be compiled into her seminal works. She juggles letters to government officials, donors, and fellow reformers with precise care. Mainstream historians recognize the literary quality of her prose, clear, persuasive, and occasionally poetic. A quirky tidbit. She sometimes punctuated letters with tiny sketches of wards and patients, as if her thoughts demanded visual accompaniment. Scholars still argue whether these marginalia were intended as practical guides or mere aesthetic flourish, but their charm is undeniable. Finally, she reflects on her life's work in quiet moments, walking through hospital gardens or along the Bosphorus shores, noting how the light strikes the water and how the scent of flowers mixes with antiseptics. Mainstream accounts emphasize her meditation on duty and service, while fringe tales suggest she sometimes confided in animals, cats, sparrows, or the occasional stray dog, as if nature itself understood the pressures of caregiving. Scholars still debate how much these small rituals contributed to her mental resilience, but the intimate humanization of Florence is clear. By the day's end, Florence Nightingale embodies a bridge between meticulous care, statistical innovation, and human empathy. You feel the intensity of her dedication reverberate, sensing that the quiet insistence on improvement, the gentle reproof of neglect, and the ever-present lamp are as much a part of her legacy as the hospitals she reformed. You trudge through the corridors of memory, imagining Florence Nightingale's later years, each step echoing the soft rhythm of a life spent illuminating darkened wards. And you probably won't survive this reflection without feeling the quiet awe of her enduring impact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and perhaps share your local time, because even across continents, moments of reflection are shared experiences. By now, Florence has largely withdrawn from public scrutiny, but her work continues to ripple through hospitals across Britain and beyond. Mainstream historians praise her pioneering use of data and statistical visualization to improve hospital care, transforming anecdotal complaints into measurable evidence. You can picture her meticulously arranging colored charts and graphs, turning dry numbers into compelling visual arguments for reform. A quirky tidbit, she occasionally annotated her charts with tiny sketches of lamps, ward layouts, and even smiling patients, reminders that data always tells a human story. Scholars still argue whether these annotations were for practical instruction or personal solace, yet they provide a glimpse into her meticulous mind. Even in retirement, she remains a guiding presence for nurses, hospital administrators, and reformers. Her letters continue to advise and inspire, full of practical guidance and ethical reflection. Mainstream sources note that her advice shaped nursing curricula for decades, while fringe accounts suggest she sometimes signed letters with small doodles of her beloved animals, cats and birds that flitted through her rooms, as if infusing each instruction with life and comfort. Scholars still debate the authenticity of some anecdotes, but the intent to humanize care is unmistakable. Florence's health, fragile from decades of rigorous work, forces slower days, yet her mind remains active, analyzing reports, responding to inquiries, and observing the evolution of hospitals she helped to reform. Mainstream historians celebrate her analytical rigor and the continuing relevance of her recommendations, while quirky accounts describe her practicing secret handwriting exercises to maintain dexterity, often on scraps of leftover hospital paper. Scholars still argue whether these were habit, obsession, or creative therapy, but they demonstrate her persistent engagement. As she nears the end of her life, Florence Nightingale embodies a synthesis of compassion, innovation, and perseverance. You can sense the rhythm of her days, quietly, steadily, illuminating lives with knowledge and care. Mainstream accounts position her as the founder of modern nursing, a statistician, and a reformer, while fringe stories like her nocturnal walks through lamplit gardens or conversations with pigeons enrich her human narrative. Scholars still debate which elements are fact versus myth, yet the essence of her legacy, transforming hospital care through dedication and insight, shines indisputably. You feel the subtle weight of her impact, the quiet hum of lamps in empty wards, the gentle whisper of paper as letters are written, and the soft footfalls of those inspired by her principles. The lamps she carried, the charts she crafted, and the standards she enforced collectively embody the power of persistence, vision, and unwavering human empathy. Even as centuries pass, her principles guide nurses, administrators, and caregivers, reminding the world that care, attention, and meticulous effort create lasting transformation. You sink deeper into the quiet of the night, letting the story of Florence Nightingale's life wrap around you like a soft, familiar blanket. Imagine the gentle glow of her lamp casting long shadows across cold stone floors, the faint rustle of pages as she reviews notes, and the faint, rhythmic tapping of her pen as she drafts guidance that will echo for generations. Her presence is not loud or dramatic. It is steady, unwavering, the kind of persistent light that slowly illuminates an entire world. You might feel your eyelids grow heavier as the hum of distant hospital wards mingles with the imagined whisper of her meticulous instructions. Each breath you take seems synchronized with the slow cadence of her life, the way she approached every task, every patient, every report with profound dedication. The wind outside brushes softly against windows, reminiscent of her quiet walks, her eyes scanning for details, her mind balancing compassion with precision. Even as her body weakened, her intellect remained sharp, shaping the framework of nursing education, hospital hygiene, and healthcare policy. You sense her curiosity, her tireless attention to detail, her insistence that facts and care must coexist. Scholars may still debate the nuances of her contributions, but you feel the essence of her work, a human touch grounded in knowledge and purpose. You drift through memories of her lamplit rooms, hearing the soft steps of nurses she trained, imagining them absorbing lessons, translating her meticulous notes into care that nurtured countless lives. The world feels calmer as you picture wards organized, charts updated, and patients treated with dignity, all because one woman refused to settle for mediocrity. Fringe tales, like her secret sketches or conversations with birds, linger like gentle reminders that greatness need not be solemn. It can carry warmth, quirks, and humanity. Historians may argue over these stories, but they enrich the tapestry of her life, giving you small smiles as your mind softens into rest. Let the story's final images settle, the glow of lamps fading into dawn, the quiet shuffle of pages, the patient's relieved sigh, and Florence's calm satisfaction knowing that her work endures. You feel the steady pulse of her legacy, the rhythm of care flowing outward, the reassurance that persistence, compassion, and insight can reshape a world. As your body relaxes and thoughts slow, allow the story to fade gently, leaving behind a calm whisper of inspiration, a reminder that one life lived with purpose and care can illuminate centuries. Drift, knowing that even in silence, the echoes of dedication continue to light the world.